clear and straightforward. When we think of ruins, basically you have two ways of understanding ruins. The first is time and history creates ruins. Like if you think about it, Pasargad is the tomb of King Cyrus in ancient Persia, now Iran, which was 2,500 years ago, which has now become completely a ruin, but is still there. The second one, if you think about it, is the capital of Persia at that point, Persepolis, that was completely torn into a ruin by Alexander the Great invading it and putting it into fire. And that's how it turned into ruins. All right, so let me present my presentation on ruins and crisis of images by reminding us of three basic truths we have learned about human beings and their behavior from René Girard and his mimetic theory. One, man is the most mimetic animal on Earth. And this could be good news or it can be bad news. It can be good news because it gives progress. The imitation brings progress, development, advancement, or it could be bad news because this brings envy, rivalry, destruction, and war. So mimetic desire is both good news and bad news. In some cases, they call it positive mimesis and negative mimesis, but I wouldn't go into that, where you just want to focus on mimetic desire. The second good news is that we can learn, create, and advance our civilization by imitating. By imitating, it is bad news because we quickly get into conflicts created by mimetic desire and proceed to generate scapegoats and sacrifice them to resolve the critical issue, sacrificial crisis that we have created because of the mimetic desire. Okay? We then sacrifice the scapegoat, and that is the process of finding peace and order again. Okay, we have all learned about the Son of Mary, Jesus, and Christmas, and everyone loves Christmas because it brings joy and peace. And when Christmas comes along, we're happy. We wish each other and the whole world peace and joy to everyone and to ourselves and our families. Yes, that's good. That's what René Girard taught me, other than mimetic desire. But he also taught me something else. He taught me that Jesus Christ was also scapegoated and was sacrificed. Okay? So that's also something that we need to realize about Jesus. And that's something that Girard taught me and brought to my attention. Before then, I always thought about Jesus with Christmas and wishing everyone good news. But no, Easter is what's important. The whole process of the passion, his death and his resurrection. Okay? Okay. Apart from that, let me see. There are 3 points that I want to cover. I covered the first two, and so let's see when we can get to the third point that Girard taught us and what that third point is at the time it comes. Aztecs. If you went to the talk earlier on, you got an introduction to sacrifice of the Aztecs. Okay, well, human sacrifices of scapegoats have existed, but they have simply changed their forms and shape to suit the times. Here in Mexico, we have the 14th century Aztecs ruins. Let's examine them. Tombs, drawings, spaces, and places with images where human sacrifices were created to gods. It's important that the sacrifices were dealt on top of an altar, on top of a place where the priest could take out the heart and offer to the god. I don't know if we will have that slide. We'll see. Okay. What's important also is that in Girard writes, in the Aztec rites, a certain time elapses between the election of the victim and the execution. During this time, every effort is made to gratify his desires. The people prostrate themselves before him, fight for the privilege of touching his garments. He is treated like a king, almost like a god. Yet this reverential treatment ends in brutal murder. How wonderful. They treat him like a god, and then they murder him. That is the case of scapegoats that Girard kind of finds everywhere in epic culture. Even if you think about Easter and the sacrifice of Jesus, Palm Sunday, we celebrate Palm Sunday. What is Palm Sunday? Palm Sunday is a week before Jesus enters Jerusalem for his execution on the cross, and everybody shouts, Hosanna, oh Hosanna, and they welcome him. Okay, so we need to thank Girard not only for his discovery of mimetic desire and his reading of a scapegoat mechanism, but shortly before he died, he also gave us a third point, and we will get to that third point. The 20th century gave us World War I and World War II and countless wars that happened yesterday and are happening now. Wars without end. World War I, World War I, two, ruins. That's what I'm talking about. With more time that passes, instead of one person getting sacrificed, millions of people get sacrificed. Thanks to technology, bad imitation, rivalry, envy. Ruins, World War II. Ruins, World War II. Ruins, World War II. Ruins, World War II. Hiroshima, ruins, World War II. Nagasaki, ruins, World War II. All right, so what is now the situation of images? We're talking about images. What is going on at the time of World War II in terms of images? How are images captured? The Aztecs drew and painted to convey their rituals, to preserve their rituals, to preserve their memory of their religion and how they go on for future generations. After the Aztecs, fast forward to World War II, 20th century, what did they do to preserve their memory? What about cinema? We have photography. First of all, let me just say something. I'm somewhat uncomfortable when we use the word war. It's too easy, too conventional. It's too easy to wage war, just as it is to one or two people get killed. Rather than sacrificing human to gods, as we just saw with the Aztecs, we have replaced it with sacrificing thousands, if not millions, with bombs. Endlessly, ruins are formed. Our military leaders are fond of creating ruins. The more ruins, the greater their victory. But with each war and creation of ruins, human desire to scapegoat is not extinguished. One side continues to create ruins, the other side shifts to document and recall the sacrificial crisis, the war, which created the ruins. Images do this. Just as Aztec painted the sacrificial acts to preserve and remember them, 19th century gave us photography, and soon after that, along with photography in 1895, it gave us cinema to document and create narratives in a hyper-real manner. Now mankind's horrors will never be forgotten. Let's look at American cinema during World War II. Wonderful Wizard of Oz. 13 Night. Gone with the Wind. 1940. Orson Welles, 1941. The Big Citizen Kane. The greatest film ever made. He thought he was working in a playground with big, giant toys. And he made the greatest film by critics and directors alike. Casablanca, 1942. Ingrid Bergman, Humphrey Bogart. Okay. All right. World War II. The question I have to ask and propose an answer to is, beyond existing forms of images that have sacrificial crisis given rise to new forms of expression? That's an interesting question to ask. It's a challenge. Has sacrificial crisis and war given to new forms of representation, of images, of people, of life, of the world? How was that? Who was that? Where did they come from? Well, for images to stay alive, or first of all, are we really stuck in a crisis of images? For images to stay alive and function, they need to breathe, embrace change, progress, and development. Nothing is worse than a stagnating desire. A repetition of an image without change. Without change, images too will stagnate and become part of the ruins. Here, the cinematic image came to rescue and address this desire by creating a new form, a new look. A new understanding and perspective, a new formula for the image and the cinema. After World War II, Italian filmmakers faced a crisis of images where they no longer could make their films. They had no actors, no studios, and all was destroyed and reduced to ruins. Rather than abandoning their craft of making films, they chose to use the war-created ruins and non-actors to make their films. Anything change? We'll see. What are these films? Post-war Italian realistic cinema. Rome Open City, 1945, Roberto Rossellini. De Sica, 1946, Shushai. Paysan, Roberto Rossellini, 46. Germany, Year Zero, Roberto Rossellini, 48. Luciano Visconti, 48, Earth Trembles. Rizzo Amarado, Giuseppe De Santis, 1949. Stromboli, Roberto Rossellini, 1950. By the way, that's Ingrid Bergman, the same actress who played with opposite of Humphrey Bogart in Casablanca. Miracle in Milan, Victoria De Sica, 1951. Bicycle Thief, Victoria De Sica, 1951. This is perhaps my favorite. And their desire, basically, essentially, their desire created a new form of using images. Their desire did not die. Images showing ruins of post-war in a new realism, or what they came to call neorealism cinema, a cinema with more realistic than ever. And Girard, in his last book, reminds us. And, oh, 9/11, where did that come from? I thought we had moved on. What's this? Ukraine. Oh, I thought we had moved on. Ruins. Oh, Gaza. Oh, we have moved on, but we haven't moved on. What about cinema? What about images? Anything change? There's got to be some proposal. The Italians gave us the proposal of neorealism, how to deal with images. Use the ruins, use what you have. Now there's a whole critique of Hollywood by great directors of America that the crisis of images really is in Hollywood. They don't know how to make real films anymore. They use gimmicks. But what about the world? Any other thing? Number 3, Girard proposes. Humans must abstain from retaliation, and retaliation into the extremes. That's from his last book, Battling to the End. And at this point, all I can say is I encourage all of you to see a realistic Italian film for yourself to see how they dealt with ruins and making films for yourself. And perhaps even, if possible, meditate on your proposal of don't retaliate, forgive, be Christ-like. Big challenge, but possible. So that's all I have to propose and express today's presentation, both in terms of images as well as the mimetic theories approach, possible approach, with hope, with the possibility of a good solution. So there we go. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I answer a question?
Yeah.
So they were sacrificing to a god, which was a very specific god, and they knew what their god.
Correct. God of the sun. Yes, correct.
But say years later, in Germany, they were also making the sacrifice, but it was a god. Was it Caesar?
No, it was not a god. That's correct. But it was basically they were sacrificing human beings in order to rival for the territory that they expressed. War. Essentially, that was my first part of my presentation. I think the word war forgets all about the sacrificial aspect of war. It's too easy. Everybody uses the word war as much as people chewing gum. It's that easy, but it shouldn't be that easy. It's a sacrificial crisis is what it is. They are sacrificing people, not to God, not to a small g God, not to a big G God, but they're sacrificing people like the Holocaust.
It is unconscious. It is an unconscious sacrifice. Is that correct?
Well, with war of the 20th century, or even, I don't think it's unconscious. No, it's not. It's planned. I don't think any of the wars that we have right now is unconscious. I mean, I don't want to get into politics, but I don't think Ukraine is unconscious. I don't think Gaza and Israel is unconscious. I don't think Alexander's overtaking of Persia and putting the capital to fire, which is now ruins, unconscious. No, it's an action. It's an offense. It's a direct offense. You slap me, I'll slap your cheek. I'll slap your other cheek. I mean, Girard really does go into basically saying the only solution for this kind of a crisis is to turn the other cheek, follow the kingdom of God, essentially. Don't retaliate. Don't slap the other cheek. No, it's a good question because it does kind of even make me think. Because when I was preparing this, I was thinking, well, I really don't like the word war. I mean, that was really what my problem was. I just chewing gum. That's what it is. It's very simple. It's as simple as chewing gum and throwing it out. So I thought, wait a minute, sacrificial crisis. That is exactly what that is. But we don't have you don't have to have a scapegoat to have that sacrificial in this model. Well, that's fine. If someone plans to take over your house, they have a plan, they have an agenda, and they do it. If Germany or a country has a plan to take over a piece of land like Gaza, they have a plan, they attack, and they do it. They don't need a scapegoat. And should they need a scapegoat, it's very easy to find one. That's what's Jesus. Simple. Find the scapegoat, execute, put him on cross. And that's what Girard reveals in Things Hidden, this big book. Jesus is a scapegoat, not Jesus, Merry Christmas, Jesus the Easter. Scapegoat, revelation. Yeah. So I don't want to depress anyone anymore. I try to end with a good note.
See bicycle.
Yeah.
Want to see Italian real.
Yes.
I have that for me.
Yes. Yeah. See Bicycle Thief. I'm not going to promise you will have a uplifting ending, and it's not. It's. I tell you something. Neo-realism. Look at the word, realism. It doesn't promise what the American films promise: happy ending. You know, Wonderful Wizard of Oz or things like that. It's a reality that they capture, which is all about people after war, how they live, how they struggle. And it's phenomenal what they do. Aesthetically, they wrote a manifesto for it, and they implemented it. To this day, by the way, is practiced. Iranian cinema is completely neorealistic cinema after the revolution. They don't have money. They made the films anyway. Their phenomenal Cannes Festival completely gives them the #1 prize. Did I mention the Gaza? Yeah, five broken cameras. They made a documentary, just Israeli and Palestinian filmmaker documenting the Gaza. Anyway, that's the realism for you. Okay. Next.
Okay. So, hope you're on the religion, the scapegoat in animated feature films. So let's try to lighten the tone now. Speaking about animation. Just for a quick presentation, my name is Felipe. I'm from Brazil. I'm not an academic, actually. This is my first time ever presenting an article like that, a paper. And I've been studying Girard just for about 2 years. And I'm actually a screenwriter for television. And so this is my article on animation. Okay, so just a little test. There's an underlying question beneath the title of this year's theme, Desire Among the Ruins, Mimesis, and the Crisis of Representation. And that is whether there is any reason to be hopeful about the future of mankind. If there is a crisis, there must be reasons to despair. But how far we should despair and where to place our hopes if we still have any, these are all open questions. The quality of our answers will be contingent on our ability to hope sincerely and not from a place of rivalry. So are there any reasons to be hopeful? To this, I want to respond with a resolute and resounding yes. I think there is reason to hope. My own hope today is to be able to demonstrate this by showing that what René Girard used to call the revelation, namely the revelation of the sacrificial origins of human culture and of the scapegoat mechanism, this revelation is truly working all around us, often hiding in plain sight, for we have eyes and do not see. The place I want us to look for signs of this revelation today may seem improbable for something so divine and important, but it is there nonetheless, however strange or unlikely. Once you see it, you can no longer miss it. It is also not so strange at all once you think about it. since there's no better audience to hear about our collective guilt than our children who are still innocent. I am talking, of course, about the art of animation, as my title indicates, but to this we could add the whole related art form of filmmaking for young audiences, the works of Disney and DreamWorks and Studio Ghibli and so on, and all the other studios out there. But wait a minute. Do you mean Divine Revelation has been working with Disney and DreamWorks and other big studios and corporations to make a profit from some disguised Christian proclamation? That's not quite it. But what I think is that if there is any such a thing as a progressive revelation of our scapegoat tendencies, as with which art has theorized comes straight from the Judeo-Christian scriptures, then whether René was right or wrong about its source, its work must be truly everywhere. And I see no reason why we should not take account of the fact that there's no place in the world today where the so-called scapegoat mechanism has become more explicit than in a very large sample of animated feature films. It's almost as if the genre itself had been chosen. Now, I'm not going to argue on the true nature of this revelation, whether it is divine or mechanical, stemming from Christ or Jewish law or something else, but I do want to confirm it is there. I do not know if it is there in modern theology and religion. I do not know if it is there in modern art and modern criticism of art. And I especially do not know, of that I'm most suspicious, if it is there in politics. But I do know it is there in cartoons. So to make my point clearer, we must first identify the various ways in which contemporary animation has been representing the image of the scapegoat. For conciseness, I will focus on English language animation alone. So let us start where it is, I think, most obvious, in the archetypes that I like to call the shapeshifter and the friendly monster. Take How to Train Your Dragon, 2010. Here we meet a society of Vikings in which all hierarchies depend in one activity and one activity alone, the hunting of dragons. But it happens that a certain teenage Viking who dreams of being a dragon hunter someday suddenly befriends, ironically but expectedly, a dragon. By the end of the movie, the boy and the dragon have become such good friends that they can no longer go back to their former ways. The adventure ends when the boy finally teaches his whole civilization that they do not need to fear the dragons, nor kill them as they have always done, but they can ride them and be friends, and even, as the title suggests, train them. Now, is this too naive? This message of peace between humans and actual monsters may surely sound naive, but only as long as we remain ignorant of the fundamental message that the movie is really trying to convey, that an entire society can be based on arbitrary scapegoating. The same story arc can be seen in Netflix's The Sea Beast 2022. It is the same allegory, in fact, with the sole difference that now we have sea monsters in the place of dragons and sailors in the place of Vikings. The friendship between the beast and the hunter is also intermediated by the character of a little girl, but the structure is still the same and the meaning obvious. The allegorical message of the story is made even more explicit when the characters find out that their entire society had been lied to. Everyone had been taught that the sea monsters had started a war against humans. But at some point, the characters find out that these stories were all made up, maintained by the king and queen. Their entire society was predicated on a lie, on a myth, on a scapegoat. Or take Nimona, also from Netflix 2023. The title character here is a little girl who is a shapeshifter. She can transform into any creature, big or small, at her will. But before the audience meets her, we are presented to this high civilization, living in an advanced metropolis. We meet a soldier in the last days of his training. He has been told all his life that he must fight to help keep monsters at bay. One day he is falsely accused of trying to kill the queen whom he was sworn to protect. Now a fugitive, he meets Nimona, who becomes his helper. But in trying to prove his innocence, he soon finds out again that his entire society was based on a lie. There were never any monsters to begin with threatening their society from outside. There was only Nimona, inside, being persecuted by a fearful crowd. In a beautiful flashback scene, we learn that when this metropolis was only a small village, the young Nimona, who had come from the forest, had befriended a little pilgrim girl. But at some point, the adults from the village saw her transformations and were afraid. When they attacked her, she turned into a bigger beast and a bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, the escalation to the extremes. Suddenly, the pilgrim girl joins her people because she has been told that her new friend is a monster. She grabs a wooden sword and points it bravely at Nimona, telling her to go back to the forest. Seeing that she has lost her only friend, Nimona runs away in tears. But now the montage jump cuts to an image of this great golden statue many years later in the center of their great metropolis. It is the city's hero, a tall blonde lady pointing her mighty sword, bravely keeping the monsters at bay. Now we know that this hero was only that little girl. Their entire civilization was based on a distorted account, a myth, a scapegoat. The idea of the founding murder here is almost fully explicit. There's no murder, of course, because this is a children's movie, but one gets the gist. It is not the murder, but the innocence of the scapegoat that is being revealed, along with the prospect that civilization, with all its wonders and technology, is based upon a great invisible injustice. That much is explicit. Another very similar story can be seen in Wolfwalkers 2020. It is the same story as Nimona almost, but instead of a made-up society, we now have a historical one, 17th century Ireland. Here, the Christians are the persecutors, as they have often been in history, and the scapegoat is also a shapeshifter, a wolfwalker, as the film calls them. It all begins when a little girl called Robin Goodfellow, who dreams of being a hunter like her father, meets a strange girl in the forest who calls herself a wolfwalker, meaning that every night while asleep, her spirit turns into a wolf. The two girls become friends, and Robin learns to be a wolfwalker herself. But now the Lord Protector of the city wants all wolves to be hunted because he knows what's going on. And soon Robin is hunted by her own father while trying to warn him of the injustices being done to all these people, the last wolfwalkers, presumably the last remains of a pagan shamanistic society. But that is far from the last of it. In recent times, we have seen the image of the shapeshifter in almost every new feature film if it is animated. Luca 2021 is about a boy who comes from a whole family of sea creatures. They look like humans in dry land, but turn back into their scales whenever they touch water. Turning Red 2022 is about a girl whose entire family turns into monsters, big red pandas in this case. As with Luca, her parents try to teach her to repress her emotions, to hold her transformations back until she can't. Wasn't The Little Mermaid also about this same idea, that of a sea creature having to repress her voice and personality, either to fit amongst the humans or in the mermaid world? Wasn't Beauty and the Beast also about a persecuted monster, a shapeshifter, who turns out was nothing but a rich man hated for his bad manners, another scapegoat? Isn't Shrek a persecuted monster? The story here is more ironic in that this ogre likes being an ogre. He resents humans, prefers to be left alone, and loves to be both feared and revered. In a word, he enjoys playing the role of the scapegoat. But the same angry mob who follows Gaston into the castle of the beast by the climax of that film is also the angry mob who catches Shrek in his bathtub in the beginning of this one. How about Lilo and Stitch? Is it also about a persecuted monster, this time an alien, who befriends a little innocent girl, much like Spielberg's E.T.? Wasn't Aladdin just as much about unjust persecution, this time the shapeshifter being the genie who helps Aladdin disguise, shapeshift from a pauper into a prince? Brave, Brother Bear, The Emperor's New Groove, Princess and the Frog, Raya and the Last Dragon, Moana, you name it. In all these movies, the shapeshifter is the scapegoat. In all these titles, the political allegory is transparent. Always there is a sense that our entire society is being criticized and that it tries to keep worlds apart that cannot stay forever apart. And the attempt to hold these borders in place always comes at the expense of an innocent victim belonging to both worlds at once, a shapeshifter, a scapegoat. Even when we don't find that shape-shifting character, what we find is a portrait of a society holding tightly to its own false conceptions, born of empty social rivalries and injustices, such as the class struggle in Aladdin, the strict gender roles in Mulan, or the purest and most insidious form of scapegoating of all, the racism and the fear of physical deformity in the Hunchback of Notre Dame. Now, at this point, someone should ask, but isn't this theme a little too broad? And it certainly is. The theme of the scapegoat is, in a sense, so universal that I'm sure you can find it everywhere you look. Girardians will certainly have an experience with that. But here we must remember the Girardian distinction between stories that are structured by scapegoating and stories which have scapegoating as a theme. What matters is not whether the theme is there or isn't. What matters is how far we can sense an awareness of it, and how far this awareness is used to proclaim the innocence of the victim, the blindness of the persecutors, and the relevance of the social effect in promoting a self-perpetuating social cohesion which is ultimately based in violence. As a genre that takes much inspiration from folktale, the animated film tends to be a mixture of both. It always denounces the persecution of a victim hero, and it is always structured around the scapegoating of a villain. That much is granted. But if we follow the archetypes of the shapeshifter and the friendly monster, what we find is that the social and political aspect of the scapegoat theme has become more pronounced now than it was ever before. That is why I think it is undeniable that these films, the most contemporary ones at least, must have scapegoating as a theme that they dare to denounce and are not just structured around it. This does not mean, of course, that we have dispensed with the villain. Far from it. There are still villains in almost every animated film you can watch, and they are often female and aristocratic. That much hasn't changed. But most villains are now political villains, like the director in Nimona, the king and queen in Sea Beast, and the Lord Protector in Wolfwalkers. They all hold political views explicitly much like those of Caiaphas in the Gospels, who says that it is better that one man shall die for the people than a whole nation perish. This is still a form of scapegoating, of course, but this politically, ideological villain is more than just our regular brand of scapegoats. In fact, I think they're the perfect scapegoats for a society who has just become conscious of scapegoating. We cannot see our own scapegoating, of course, but it is because we now know that scapegoating exists that to scapegoat more effectively, we must accuse our scapegoats of scapegoating. And this again proves our point, that the scapegoating is becoming more explicit as a theme and not just as a structuring principle. Now, as their scope enlarges, we will begin to see differences in the plots of these films, with various themes being subsidized. But the comparative study of all these films allows us to see a common meaning, especially if we start from the later examples where this social-political theme is most explicit. Once we take the shapeshifter and the friendly monster as the main image of the scapegoat theme in the animated genre, other common tropes, which seemed unrelated at first, will begin to show themselves as taking part in a coherent whole. The medium itself has been evolving towards a greater revelation of the scapegoat mechanism. One of these tropes is the split society, as in Romeo and Juliet. We see it in Zootopia, where an animal society is split between herbivores and carnivores, or in Elemental, where there are ghettos in a city for creatures made of fire, earth, water, and air, until a girl of fire and a boy of water enter a relationship, only to discover by the end of the film that they do not die if they touch. In any of these films, it is revealed in the end that their divide was predicated on a lie, much like we already saw in How to Train Your Dragon. The difference is that in Dragon, the divide was symbolized as a split between two species, humans and monsters. And in Monsters Incorporated, we have an inversion of the trope where we begin from the perspective of the latter. Another trope, the family upon whose unity depends a much larger order. We see it in Coco and Kanto, Onward, the Mitchells versus the Machines. Even if there are no monsters here, these protagonists are indeed scapegoats in that they risk everything in their universe by failing to fulfill their family's expectations, much like we saw in Luca and Turning Red. This other trope has been so overused it has become a cliche, the rehabilitation of a former villain. We see it in Maleficent, Cruella, Wicked. Why have all these villains been picked up? If not that we want to make sure that everybody knows they're scapegoats and that we must hear their side of the story. Here we have an interesting gender gap. We tend to only revisit the female villains. On the male side, we make original ones just to ridicule. Despicable Me, Megamind, the often retold The Grinch. But we ridicule these villains only to show in the end that they also have a heart, and that they may have become villains precisely because they were scapegoated even before they were guilty. About this gender gap, I can think of only two exceptions. On the female side, it is Frozen, and on the male side, the Joker. But these are exceptions that prove the rule, because the most beloved Disney princess in decades, Elsa from Frozen, her status as a victim is so pronounced that we almost forget she's a villain. She's much more of a princess, but she has the attributes of a witch, a cold witch. And this is contrary to the Joker, whose status as a victim, even in his own film, is so debatable that it is questionable whether we're even meant to take the character's side, which is why Joker is no children's film and falls outside her present scope. To end this talk on a little more critical note, it would be necessary to go into the golden age of animation, where the genre began. I must point out that while the old Disney classics are often criticized for being too stereotypical, which they can be, still, have they not laid the foundation? Isn't Snow White a victim of persecution, and Cinderella, and Sleeping Beauty? Look again at their names. We know from Gerard and others that Oedipus means swollen foot, king's swollen foot, which is obviously a pejorative. But what about Sleeping Beauty? Does this not also sound like an old pejorative? Perhaps for someone lazy, someone who we think should be working on the spindle, but she barely touched her instruments and decided that she prefers the bed, perhaps even a sex worker. Could Snow White have something to do with the paleness of death, as if implying that if a girl sees too many men at once and causes envy to the other women, one day she'll end up dead in the snow and we'll pretend we don't see her? Could Cinderella from the French Cendrillon, meaning Little Ashes, could she have been someone who we mistreated at a party once, saying her dress looked like a pumpkin and that she looked like someone's maid until she ran into the night after thrusting her shoe at someone's head? I know these interpretations are all speculative, of course, but the cumulative evidence speaks volumes. In folktale, as in animation, the heroes are always innocent. They are not scapegoats, but cleared scapegoats. But we have only believed in their innocence by projecting our guilt as persecutors into the villain. And we have believed in our own innocence for so long that we have lost the key to the real meanings of these stories. But if we already agree that the old villains were our scapegoats, and if the villains persecuted the princesses, then logically, the princesses must have been the original scapegoats, of which the persecutors were ourselves. Just you look at the protagonists of any of these Disney films and tell me if they are not all born of stereotypical accusations. Tarzan and Mowgli are uncivilized, Peter Pan is immature and won't grow up, Robin Hood is a thief. When a child lies to his mother, even today, won't she call him a Pinocchio? When a boy has bigger ears than the rest of his class, don't they call him a Dumbo, implying that he is dumb, that he won't listen, that his big ears must serve for something else, like stretching and pulling? But the story tells us that Robin Hood is innocent because he never stole to himself, that Tarzan and Mowgli were abandoned, that Peter Pan literally won't grow up for he's magical and he's envied for it. Pinocchio was still in the process of becoming a real boy when he lied, and Dumbo's ears did serve for something else, and it was fine. Whatever their source, these children's stories, as we like to call them, are always inspired in stereotypical accusations. And considering this, I ask again, have not these films been responsible, at least in part, in shaping our modern sensitivities to injustice? I think they have. And I think the argument can even be made that these early classics were often less romantic than many of their contemporary counterparts. They were more Romanesque in the Girardian sense. Despite more political, contemporary animation sometimes seems further immersed in what Girard has called the romantic lie, the idea of an autonomous individual who is the owner and source of his own aspirations and desires. But in the Disney Golden Age, I think we find hints that this view is false. Isn't the evil queen's magical mirror a symbol of her envy, of her wanting to be like Snow White? Aren't Cinderella's stepsisters mimetic doubles to each other? Don't all Disney heroes serve as models to the weaker characters, teaching them by example? Cinderella with the mice and Snow White with the dwarfs. Don't we always see in those films a symmetry of good and evil, good and bad mimesis, envy versus positive discipleship? And when we look at most of these male protagonists, aren't they all on a journey searching for their own identities? Pinocchio, Bambi, Mowgli, Dumbo, and don't they all seek who they are by mimicking others? Contemporary animation has done a wonderful job of underlying the political aspects of scapegoating, but they have mostly done so by telling us that scapegoating has to do with some big social political lie, something contingent and external on which we can blame our parents but not ourselves. The value of the classics, I think, is that they emphasize a deeper dynamic that really brings scapegoating about: envy, desire, misplaced identity. Perhaps the reason the old villains have retained so much interest is that despite being our scapegoats, these films still treated them as something human. In being so arbitrarily villainous, we could see it in their eyes that it was someone like us. They were envious, they were childish, they were portrayed as mimetic. Like us, they feel their subjectivity is lacking. Yet, contrary to an old cliche, I have a good feeling about this. The revelation may not be complete, but it has not been stagnant. I dare say animation, the art of giving life, is truly a place where life reveals itself to us, and I insist, despite our bias against their happy endings, that the animated film is a place beyond religion where we can go and bring back hope wholeheartedly. Thank you. When I got questions, sure.
Eight. You have to go to the light. Okay.
So, quick question.
Sure.
First of all, thank you for your excellent representation, excellent presentation.
Thanks.
Two questions. First of all, I'm glad you came after me with all these fun pictures. So better than my pictures. So one question I have is, can you root the first animation cartoon that dealt with scapegoat,
The first animation cartoon that
dealt with scapegoating?
Well, in a way, I think they all kind of do, in some sense, because, like I said, when we get these early films, even the first animated feature film, Snow White, it was based on an earlier folktale, and I think these folktales already dealt with scapegoats in a way, in a sense. So my theory, but I haven't looked much into the folktale themselves. But what I seem to think, what is being suggested to me by making this comparative analysis, it seems to me that these heroines, these princesses, they seem to be clear scapegoats. They seem to be perhaps based in old pejoratives, old ideas, old stereotypical accusations, and someone seems to have had the idea of making up a story which take these accusations and make them into an innocent victim which is persecuted by someone. So we're also projecting our guilt as persecutors into the villain. So what I think they deal with scapegoating already. I think they all kind of do.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so good evening. I will talk to you about Dekalog by Krzystof Kieslowski, Mimetic Dynamics and Phenomenological Awareness in Dekalog. In September 1989, the Venice Film Festival saw the premiere of Dekalog, a 10-part film series by Polish director Krzystof Kieslowski, inspired by the Ten Commandments. Nearly 35 years later, the series is regarded as a masterpiece of film history the world over. Initially, Krzystof Kieslowski mostly made documentaries. In his own words, in the early 1970s, he wanted to, quote, describe what communist Poland and its people really looked like, end quote. Gradually, however, he came up against the limits of his method. The intimate face of people does not give itself away so easily. Kieslowski then approached feature film as the genre that better reveals the hidden aspects of reality. The 10 films of his Dekalog series, each about an hour long, are a highlight in this regard. The big problem of a documentary is that it somehow falls into its own trap, notes Kieslowski in a conversation with film critic Derek Malcolm. And he goes on by saying, the closer the documentary filmmaker's camera gets to a human object, the more that human object seems to disappear in front of the camera. When I'm making a film about love, I can't enter a bedroom where a couple is having intercourse. When I'm making a film about death, I can't film someone who is really dying. I'm even afraid of real tears. I don't know if I have the right to film them. As a filmmaker, I cross boundaries and enter areas that are normally forbidden. That may be the main reason why I left documentary filmmaking. As You Like It, the famous comedy by William Shakespeare, describes the world as a stage on which people are merely players suited for many parts. The paradox, then, is that what is considered real life is often but a play. In the book Kieslowski on Kieslowski, the Polish filmmaker echoes the argument of the illustrious English bard. Quote, "I think that all people, and this is irrespective of the political system, have two faces," Kieslowski claims. They wear one face in the street, at work, in the cinema, in the bus or car. That's the appropriate face to wear on the outside and the appropriate face for strangers, end quote. Like a good play, Dekalog explores the other face of people, their veiled fears, dreams, and motivations. In that sense, fiction reveals more of reality than what a reporter's camera could ever capture. Communist censorship did not prevent collective film rituals in dark movie theaters from violating social taboos sometimes. Quote, "The public knew the rules by which censorship worked and waited for a signal that these rules had been bypassed," end quote, Kieslowski observes. And he goes on, quote, "Today, this basic reason for being together doesn't exist anymore. We're lacking an enemy." And he rather surprisingly adds, "It was easier to make films there then, in communist Poland, than it is under the economic censorship here in the West. Economic censorship means censorship imposed by people who think that they know what the audience wants," end quote. Dekalog introduces characters caught between their fickle desires, the demands of society, and existential questions. The setting for their individual stories is a large housing estate, consisting of boring gray apartment blocks. Quote, "It's the most beautiful housing estate in Warsaw, which is why I chose it. It looks pretty awful, so you can imagine what the others are like. The fact that the characters all live on one estate brings them together. Sometimes they meet and say, 'May I borrow a cup of sugar?' End quote. Apart from the area where they live and its social conventions, Kieslowski's characters share a tendency to do injustice to a God who is understood as love, and thus, by extension, a tendency to do injustice to humanity. Quote, "The concept of sin is tied up with this abstract ultimate authority, which we often call God," Kieslowski analyzes. And he goes on to say, "But I think that there's also a sense of sin against yourself, which is important to me and really means the same thing. Usually, it results from weakness, from the fact that we're too weak to resist temptation, the temptation to have more money, comfort, to possess a certain woman or man, or the temptation to hold more power. I believe we're just as much prisoners of our own passions, our own physiology, and certainly our own biology, as we were thousands of years ago. We're constantly imprisoned by our passions and feelings. You can't get rid of this. It makes no difference whether you've got a passport which allows you into every country or only into one, and you stay there. It's a saying as old as the world. Freedom lies within. It's true." End quote. Film director Stanley Kubrick did not hide his admirations for Dekalog. The American genius even wrote a foreword to the publication of the series Screenplays, in which he wrote, among other things, quote, "Krzystof Kieslowski and his co-author, Krzysztof have the very rare ability to dramatize their ideas rather than just talking about them. By making their points through the dramatic action of the story, they gain the added power of allowing the audience to discover what's really going on rather than being told. They do this with such dazzling skill, you never see the ideas coming and don't realize until much later how profoundly they have reached your heart." End quote. A rarely unearthed interpretive key for Dekalog lies in a statement by Krzystof, a human rights lawyer and politician who became Kieslowski's screenwriter companion. Quote, "At the basis of all my reflections lie the books of René Girard." End quote. As you know, the French-American thinker René Girard is known for his attention to the role of imitation or mimesis in interpersonal relationships and of the scapegoat mechanism as a violent foundation of culture. Already in biological terms, the genetic code is a copy, but people also acquire a cultural identity thanks to mimetic processes. They adopt the habits, language, and ideas of their environment. There also is a desire that relies on imitation and that is influenced by role models in a positive or negative sense. Girard speaks of a mimetic desire in addition to physical needs. Everyone is born with the need for oxygen, but no one is born with the desire to become a lawyer. Mimetic desire also has a flip side. It sometimes leads to rivalry and even violence if individuals cannot or do not want to share the object of their desire. Dekalog follows the Catholic numbering of the Ten Commandments and shows how they relate to a variety of mimetic processes. Canadian philosopher Yves Vaillancourt is an apt guide to highlight that relationship as he analyzed Dekalog in the light of Girard's mimetic theory. From that perspective, the neighborly love called for by the commandments materializes itself as an imitation of those who refuse to make violent sacrifice. In Dekalog, that kind of mimesis always creates the space where a vulnerable child can live fully. The lack of it, in turn, is deadly. An intriguing constant throughout Dekalog is the appearance of a quiet, mysterious man. Quote, "I introduced a character whom some called the angel. In the screenplays, he was always described as a young man. He comes, watches, and walks on. He doesn't have any influence on what's happening, but he is a sort of sign or warning to those whom he watches, if they notice him." End quote. In his symbolically rich films, Kieslowski claims to search for the surplus in reality. That remains unnoticed by those who reduce the world to what is necessary to satisfy all kinds of cravings, or to what is useful to fabricate a public face with social prestige. The young man in Dekalog symbolizes the surplus. He embodies what remains intangible to scientific measuring instruments and makes itself known only in the light of love. Quote, "You can only see things clearly with your heart," as is written in Le Petit Prince, the fairy tale by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. Rarely has that truth been so bafflingly rendered as in the story of the first Dekalog film. In it, a father finds that science and technology, despite their promises of power and control, offer him no comfort after the loss of his child. I'll give a quick overview of the 10 films and highlight some of the mimetic dynamics in each of them. So, the first commandment in Decalogue 1, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven, above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them." In the first Decalogue film, there is this moving scene where Pavel, the child, connects to his aunt. He says, "I love you," to his aunt. And she replies, "And this is what God is." Krzystof, a competitive professor of linguistics, relies on the power of digital intelligence to shape life with his 11-year-old son Pavel. Quote, and this is Yves Vaillancourt, "The professor seems to take pleasure in presenting the computer as an imitator of God. But Pavel's aunt will then sum up the attributes of God for the boy in one word: love, which Pavel is experiencing at that very moment. Love is not part of the positivist lexicon with which Pavel's father describes the computer." End quote. Krzystof places his obsession with the power of the computer above his concrete concern for Pavel, and his lecture on word associations foreshadows the fateful temptation to which he eventually succumbs. Again, this is Vaillancourt. Quote, "Among the examples Krzystof gives are the noun podjudzanie and the verb podjudzać, both constructed from the name Judas. The noun means the temptation of Judas. The verb means to do as the devil does and tempt Judas. In the film, it is the computer that gives the father the green light and says, 'Go ahead, do it. Give your child the skates and let him go out on the ice.' The computer seduces the father like the devil." End quote. A graphic representation of the activity in the brains of those who mourn does not capture the tearing reality of grief at a sudden goodbye, nor the love for the deceased that underlies that grief. In the first Dekalog film, Krzystof experiences how, in the love for his lost child, he finds a meaning that transcends him, a transcendence that cannot be manipulated and can never be fully expressed, the priceless value of a human life. Technological instruments register only bones, flesh, and blood. A more poetic language, on the other hand, expresses the moral weight of a human being, which does not allow itself to be weighed or created by man, but presents itself independently of any human decision. Krzystof only finds a home for his grief and anger in a church. His computer abandoned him. Love, in response to the unfathomable meaning of his child, tastes bitter to him, but continues to reveal itself indestructibly even through the suffering. And perhaps a tiny glimmer of hope lies therein. Time and again, Dekalog suggests that the value of a human being does not depend on the value assigned to him by fellow human beings, or on such feelings as joy and sorrow. In the irreducible value of a human life, Kieslowski recognizes the hopeful trace of a God whose grace cannot be possessed or taken away by men. Quote, "I think that an absolute point of reference does exist," Kieslowski confesses. And he continues, "As somebody once said, if God didn't exist, then somebody would have to invent him. But I don't think we've got perfect justice here on earth, and we never will have. It's justice on our own scale, and our scale is minute. We're tiny and imperfect." End quote. Righteousness takes its full form in the Bible in the choice of charity, a love that brings life, and to which the Ten Commandments also point. And now I'm quoting Andrei Shuraki, the famous Bible translator. "The law of life, its continuation and preservation, constitutes the biblical foundation of all laws." End quote. Obedience to the voice of charity, to neighborly love, frees man from deadly addictions to power, prestige, pleasure, and possession. Quote, "We're always fighting for some sort of freedom," Kieslowski asserts. End quote. In Dekalog, freedom lies in a conscience awakened by charity, love as a concern for the other's sake, and not, for example, because of his political connections, liberates the human spirit to experience reality more completely. The other cannot be reduced to a mere means that should confirm one's untruthful self-image. When one approaches the world in its entirety with this non-instrumental attitude, one's horizons expand. In this sense, charity is not merely an ethical, but also an epistemological principle, which Emmanuel Levinas made the core of his Phenomenology. In short, the good has to do with what is true, and the truth will make you free. The respect for other people puts social conventions into perspective and gives all kinds of desires their orientation. The value of one's life companion, for instance, is not diminished if that companion, due to circumstances, is no longer able to satisfy sexual needs. The 6th and 9th Dekalog film deals with that, among other things. And lust for a deceptive, supposedly respectable social image does not negate the value of an innocent fellow human being who is sacrificed to maintain that image. The love of the other for the sake of the other thwarts the love of a deceitful reputation and its socio-political power. That motive plays an important role in the 2nd, 4th, 7th, and 8th film of Dekalog. Dekalog 2. The commandment is, "You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God." Dorota, a violinist in a symphonic orchestra, is pregnant by her lover unbeknownst to her husband Andrei, who is suffering from cancer. She asks the attending physician, as it were, to pronounce divine judgment on the outcome of the disease. If Andrei dies, she will keep the child. If he survives, she will have an abortion. The old physician recalls how he came home one day during World War II and found a large cavity after a bombardment, instead of the house with his family. Vaillancourt comments, quote, "Perhaps that painful memory influenced the doctor's diagnosis, so that the child might live. The child is in danger of being swallowed up, and Dorota will have to live with a large cavity, just as the doctor had to after the bombing." Kieslowski introduces a foggy mimetism between the doctor's story and that of the people who depend on his judgment. True, the doctor saves the child, but by declaring Andrei dead, he commits perjury. Andrei survives. On his sickbed, he resembles the dead Christ from a famous painting by Andrea Mantegna, until he wakes up. In a nightly conversation with the doctor, he says of his awakening, "I am coming back from the other side." In Dekalog, Kieslowski often depicts the workings of the Ten Commandments in an ironic way. After all, the love to which the commandments give room makes use of the same human characteristics that sometimes get in the way of that love. For example, in a world marked by lies and keeping up appearances, you sometimes have to lie to tell the truth. This is especially evident in the 2nd film of Dekalog. The act of the old doctor in the 2nd Dekalog film is reminiscent of the Apostle Paul's paradoxical speech, for instance in his first letter to the Corinthians. In that letter, Paul notes that love for the marginalized and weak appears as foolishness in a world obsessed with prestige and power. Quote, "Do not deceive yourselves," Paul writes. "If you think that you are wise in this age, you should become fools so that you may become wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God." End quote. The God to whom Paul and the Ten Commandments, among others, testify, and who can be identified as a dynamic of nonviolent love, does not destroy the human world in order to set his own laws. In fact, that would be nothing but the continuation of a violent process. On the contrary, the dynamic of non-violent love dismantles and recalibrates the human endeavor from within, so that this endeavor no longer entangles and suffocates creation, but rather redeems and begets life, even if that happens through trial and error. Kieslowski shows how even ethical choices are constantly exposed to fraudulent practices and corruption. You won't find a moralistic division between good and evil, which ultimately does more harm than good because it remains blind to its own hypocrisy, in Dekalog. Quote, I think integrity is an extremely complicated combination, Kieslowski argues, and we can never ultimately say I was honest or I wasn't honest. In all our actions and all the different situations in which we find ourselves in a position from which there's really no way out. And even if there is, it's not a better way out, a good way out. It's only relatively better than the other options, or, to put it another way, the lesser evil. This, of course, defines integrity. One would like to be ultimately honest, but one can't. With all the decisions you make every day, you can never be ultimately honest. You can only be honest about your dishonesty. And now, for a quick run through the other films. Dekalog 3. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Janusz, a cab driver, leaves his family during the holy moment of Christmas Eve to clandestinely meet his former mistress, Eva. Vaillancourt notes, quote, in this film there is a reprise of the famous biblical scene with the forbidden fruit. Eva imitates her biblical namesake. End quote. Eva comes like a thief in the night that throws Janusz off guard. And we also see Krzystof from the first Dekalog film appearing as a bystander. He watches Janusz's children awaiting their father dressed as Santa Claus. Dekalog 4. Honor your father and your mother. Anka, a student at an art school, lives with Mikal, a widower, and her father, about whom it is not known for certain whether he also is Anka's biological father. Anka's friend Jarek arouses Mikal's jealousy. Vaillancourt notes, the looming union between Anka and Jarek fuels the incestuous desires between father and daughter. The women in Mikal's life, in turn, arouse Anka's jealousy. Mimetic desire circulates as much between Anka and Mikal's wives as it does between Mikal and Anka's boyfriends. End quote. And then there is the late mother as a complicated role model. Vaillancourt notes again, quote, the mother had at least 2 lovers in the year before Anka's birth. Mikal points to an old photograph at one point and says to Anka about 2 men on it, one of these 2 could be your father. Clearly, the mimetic rivalry existed before Anka was born. End quote. Anka and Mikal face the challenge of honoring a healthy difference between child and parent. And here we see Anka about to open an envelope that may contain a secret regarding her identity and the relationship with her father. And the question is whether it is not better to keep that secret. Dekalog 5. You shall not murder. It's about Jacek, who goes through life as a confused young man since his 12-year-old sister died under the tractor of a drunk driver, one of his friends. He is sentenced to death for the murder of a cab driver who functions as a scapegoat for his grief and frustrations. Vaillancourt says, quote, the film announces itself as a reflection on the punishment that murderers must face. Should the violation of the fifth commandment be met with the death penalty, and thus with an imitation of the offense itself? End quote. Piotr, the young lawyer defending Jacek, argues in advance that, quote, justice does not have to imitate nature, end quote. So, and here you see the so-called angel who shows up and as a surveyor brings into view the number of the fifth commandment right in front of the cap with Jacek in it. The Dekalog films are full of such little details. And Kieslowski also made a longer theatrical version of this film with a short film about killing. Decalogue 6, you shall not commit adultery. Tomek, a young postal clerk, regularly uses his binoculars to spy on the unmarried painter Magda and her many lovers. Eventually, he meets her in person. Vaillancourt clarifies, quote, Magda stays in the register of mimetism and assumes that Tomek wants to kiss her, that he wants to sleep with her. She assumes that Tomek wants to follow in the footsteps of the lovers he has observed, but Tomek says no to every invitation. End quote. Tomek, like a believing Thomas, not an unbelieving Thomas, seeks a tenderness that will not touch or possess. Noli me tangere. It is not a coincidence that the name of the female character is Magda, of course, Mary, a reference to Mary Magdalene. To her own surprise, Magda will emulate this Noli me tangere motif like a contemporary Mary Magdalene. And Kieslowski made a longer theatrical version of this film with a short film about love. The seventh Dekalog film, You Shall Not Steal. It's about Mashka. Mashka is pregnant with her teacher Wojtek at the age of 16. Mashka's mother Eva is the principal of the school where Wojtek teaches and wants to avoid scandal. Eva raises Anya, the child born from Mashka's pregnancy, as her own daughter and Mashka's sister. When Anya is 6, Mashka steals what is hers and kidnaps her daughter. Vaillancourt notes, as in the biblical story of the judgment of Solomon, a mimetic desire concerning motherhood manifests itself, rather than unconditional love for the child. End quote. Anya is torn between the two women until she discovers that the woman who withdraws herself from the rivalry is the true mother. And this is like one of the most moving scenes also in Dekalog. That scene that you see here, Anya who finds herself torn between two mothers. And also, Girard was asked at some point in an interview whether there is a desire beyond mimetic desire, and his answer is yes, love, for example, for your child, because then you desire the well-being of the other as other. And there's kind of we could say a lot about this, but I'll continue with the next film, the 8th film, Dekalog 8. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Zofia is a professor of ethics and is visited by Elżbieta, a Jewish woman of Polish origin who lives in the US, and translated Zofia's work. Elżbieta reveals herself as the child Zofia wanted to protect from the Nazis during World War II. Zofia's rescue operation ran aground after Elżbieta's intended adoptive father was falsely accused of collaboration. Elżbieta felt abandoned by Zofia and comes looking for answers. Vaillancourt points out, quote, truth does not come without effort. To say false things, there are many examples to imitate, but to say true things, there are few. And this is rather a comic scene. You won't learn, laughs an extremely light young man when Sophia tries to imitate him during her jogging session in the park. And you should watch the film to get the deeper meaning of what is happening there. Dekalog 9. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. Roman, a cardiologist, is told that his impotence is incurable and permanent. Thereupon, he advises his wife Hannah to seek sexual satisfaction elsewhere. Young Marius, with whom Hannah previously had an affair, resurfaces. Vaillancourt concludes, Marius unwittingly reveals the mimetic structure of the violation of the prohibition. He has lusted after another man's wife, and Roman, in turn, does the same. He had presented Hannah's lover as her legitimate sexual partner, so he is both victim and perpetrator of the violation of the prohibition. End quote. Hannah and Roman find each other again in their plans to adopt a child, with Anya from the 7th Dekalog film appearing on the scene. The scene you see here is Roman, who is talking to a patient of his, a singer, about Van den Boedenmeijer, a fictional musician behind whom Dekalog film composer Zbigniew Preissner hides. So Zbigniew Preissner often used the name Van den Boedenmeijer. And then we have the 10th and final Dekalog film. You shall not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor. It's about Jerzy and Arthur, who inherit a stamp collection from their father. When they find that others praise and covet it, the desire to secure their prized possession takes on insane proportions. This is especially evident when they purchase a stamp to complete their collection. Vaillancourt remarks, quote, that tragic burlesque scene is unique in Dekalog. The stamp is exchanged for a kidney. The mimetic lust for a trivial piece of paper results in an improbable payoff. In fulfillment of his impure desire, Jerzy gives his kidney, the organ of purification. End quote. Nevertheless, this black comedy ends well, and Kieslowski concludes his titanic effort on a cheerful note. And so here you see the stamp for which Jerzy gave up a kidney. Makes you wonder about the world we're living in. So, thank you for listening.